This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The World Today. I'm Richard Nta in Nairobi. Here's what's ahead. Russia faces off with Western powers and Ukraine in the latest of a series of gatherings aiming to ease border tensions. International peacekeeping troops in Kazakhstan have begun their exit as Kazakh officials hail their part in helping to restore calm. And the WHO Africa office speaks about the state of the pandemic on the continent. Once again, welcome to The World Today. Thank you for joining us. The World Health Organization Africa Regional Office is currently giving an update on the state of the COVID-19 pandemic on the continent and lessons learned from the Omicron variant so far. Let's listen in. Well, moving on, this World Health Organization Africa Media Briefing of the Year panelists will be discussing the latest updates on COVID-19 and the Omicron. They're also expected to provide an update on the Omicron and the management of Omicron cases. They will welcome the questions on the COVID-19 pandemic as well as other health issues in Africa. The number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in Africa has passed the 10 million mark as of Wednesday evening, and that's according to the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Well, moving on to Russia, Russian-led peacekeeping troops have reportedly begun to withdraw from the country. The troops arrived after President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. Tokayev appealed for help in quelling violence over high fuel prices. Tokayev says order has now been restored and that all foreign forces should be gone within 2 weeks. Russia sent a peacekeeping mission from the Collective Security Treaty Organization bloc to help quell what Tokayev called a terrorist threat with a foreign influence. And talks between NATO and Russia have concluded in Brussels without a clear outcome. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has described the differences between the two sides as significant, saying that they will not be an easy bridge to cross. Ross Cullen has more from Brussels. Let's take a look.
Well, the talks at NATO at the headquarters here in Brussels on Wednesday lasted for 4 hours, an hour longer than planned. But despite the extra time, still no breakthrough, no agreements between NATO and Russia as they held their first meeting of the NATO-Russia Council since July 2019. We have heard the demands from NATO. They want to see Russia remove its forces from Ukraine, Russia to remove its forces from around Ukraine, to increase transparency and to de-escalate the situation. For its part, Moscow wants an ironclad guarantee from NATO, in its words, a waterproof, bulletproof, legally binding guarantee that Ukraine will never ever join NATO. For NATO, they say that every country should be free to choose their own security arrangements. Moscow's other demands are that NATO immediately stop its eastern expansion and end its military cooperation with countries like Ukraine. So there was a bit of a battle going on when it comes to the agreement that was aimed at trying to be reached here in Brussels on Wednesday, but no such alignment was forthcoming. We can hear now a little bit of what the different delegations had to say. We can hear from Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, who was leading the talks for NATO. But first, let's listen in to Alexander Grushko. He was leading the Russian delegation and he is Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister.
In a very frank, direct way, without cutting corners or using politically correct language, we pointed out that further worsening of the situation might lead to the most unpredictable and the hardest consequences for European security.
There are significant differences between NATO allies and Russia on these issues. Our differences will not be easy to bridge, but it is a positive sign that all NATO allies and Russia sat down around the same table and engaged on substantive topics.
Both sides did leave room for future talks, but the terms and conditions about any further meetings have not yet been agreed. The NATO Secretary General said he would hope to bring new proposals, and hopefully Russia would do the same, proposals which would be designed to be areas where there hopefully could be a chance of reaching alignment, reaching an agreement, but no such agreement was reached in Brussels on Wednesday. Ross Cullen, CGTN in Brussels.
The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, with representatives from the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine, are holding talks in Vienna today. It's the first time this week Ukraine will have a seat at the table. Following Russia-NATO talks in Brussels about Russia's security demands, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Grushko said that it will become clearer what comes next once NATO presents its own proposals. Stuart Smith reports from Moscow.
Russia in particular was frustrated that NATO does not seem to be taking its concerns seriously or acting upon them quick enough. And later in the day, once the US had announced a further round of sanctions against Russia should it choose to invade Ukraine, there was pushback from Russia's ambassador to the United States, who said that this kind of action during the talks was not conducive to diplomacy. But at the same time, the United States pointed out that Russia during these talks had been holding live fire drills with around 3,000 Russian soldiers near the Ukrainian border. So it seems both sides trying to make their point not just at the table, but also in the real world as well. As we go into the talks on Thursday at the OSCE in Vienna, this is the largest number of countries that Russia has spoken to in terms of these national security demands. Russia, to be clear again, asking that the United States remove nuclear weapons from Europe, so that NATO allies do not deploy their troops on Eastern Europe, and that NATO is banned from ever joining the NATO military alliance. No progress on all of those, but this time today we are seeing Russia talk to 57 countries from North America, Central Asia and Europe. So all of these countries will have a chance to put their concerns to Russia, and Russia says it's at the end of this week when it will make a decision as to whether these talks are proving fruitful or not. But we've seen no breakthrough so far, no room for compromise on the big issues from either side, although some small chances at compromise on the smaller things like arms control and transparency. We know, though, that both sides say they are still committed to dialogue.
Let's return to our top stories at this hour. The World Health Organization Africa Regional Office is currently giving an update on the state of the COVID-19 pandemic on the continent and the lessons learned from the Omicron variant so far. Let's listen in.
Appears to be emerging from the peak of its fourth pandemic wave. Vaccination, which is a pivotal measure against this virus, remain far too low. About 50% of the world population is now fully vaccinated. In Africa, this is just 10%. Only 7 countries met the target to vaccinate 40% of their population by December 2022, and just 26 have vaccinated 10% of their population, a target that was to be reached by September last year. Currently, vaccination bottlenecks are less about supply than they are on rollout. At WHO, we are increasing our support to countries to fast-track and effectively deliver the COVID-19 doses to reach a much wider population. Specifically, we are working with governments to resolve cooperation challenges that include refining and implementing vaccine rollout strategies, pledging funding shortfall, as well as boosting collaboration with community for increased vaccination uptake. The core objective of COVID-19 vaccination are to limit severe infection and death, as well as safeguard hospital and health workers from being overwhelmed by surging infection. At the current vaccination rate, Africa is running too far behind. The coming months will be critical in Africa's effort to improve vaccination. The continent cannot afford to remain the fringe of this historic vaccination drive.
Devastating floods and landslides continue in the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais. 24 people have been confirmed killed. The state civil defense authority said 145 municipalities were under a state of emergency. At least 17,000 people have been forced to leave their homes. According to Brazil's Meteorology Institute, parts of Minas Gerais has seen more than 400 millimeters of rain in the first 10 days of 2022. Tennis's men's #1, Novak Djokovic, is included in the Australian Open official draw on Thursday, although uncertainty remains about whether the government will cancel his visa for a second time. A decision is expected today. He has sparked widespread anger in Australia over his vaccination exemption. Our correspondent Greg Navarro has more from Sydney.
Well, there are really two scenarios that are going to play out. At best, Djokovic, the defending men's champion of the Australian Open, faces a less than friendly, welcoming crowd in Melbourne when he takes to the courts for the start of the Australian Open next week. At worst, he faces losing his visa and potentially being deported. Now, we are expecting to hear from Australia's immigration minister with a decision at some point today. We're told in the last 24 hours or so, he's been reviewing additional information, additional documentation that is not helping Djokovic's case. That includes misleading information on travel declarations arriving in Australia, saying he hadn't been anywhere in the 2 weeks leading up to his arrival here, where it turns out, in fact, he had been in Spain during that time for part of the time. We do know that at least 1 or 2 days after finding out that he was COVID positive last month, he met with a journalist for an interview and actually took off his mask to pose for pictures at one point. Now, he has apologized, saying that was an error in judgment, but as I mentioned, none of this appears to be helping his case to remain, and it's fair to say that all of this has garnered a great deal of attention.
What he should is kick him out. What he will, I honestly, who knows? After hearing about what Djokovic said about how he made mistakes on his form and those little slips, I reckon he'll kick him out. No one can stuff up that badly on little things like that. Like, that's just pretty basic stuff. So, yeah, I reckon he should and will boot him.
It's just it's really disappointing that Tennis Australia has allowed for this to happen, because the Australian Open is more than one tennis player.
Now, there are unconfirmed reports that Australia's government is leaning toward cancelling Djokovic's visa for a second time. Prime Minister Scott Morrison has said rules are rules. The Deputy Prime Minister here echoing those comments, but you have to remember that Djokovic initially was given a medical exemption upon arrival to not only be here, but to participate in the Australian Open. Australia's government at some point found that they didn't like the way that was working out, that it breached Australia's ruling on people who are not vaccinated, and that's what got us to this stage. Now, if in fact the government does cancel his visa for a second time, Djokovic does have the option of bringing this all before a court once again, and could very well remain in the country until that is resolved.
Well, that's it for this edition of The World Today. I'll be back shortly with more news from the continent in Africa Live. Thanks for watching.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas, so it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
This is the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the front
within clear view of this front line position.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
France wants EU countries to slap sanctions on Mali over a plan to delay elections. South Africa Regional Bloc extends mandate of troops deployment in Mozambique. And South African schools reopen to a rotational attendance system amid fears of a surge in COVID infections. Hello and welcome to Africa Live. As always, great to have you with us. I'm Richard Nta, live in Nairobi. And for those of you joining us from across the continent and around the globe, we thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at other stories making headlines this hour. The World Bank cautions over slow economic growth and rising levels of inequality. And in sports, Gradel helps Côte d'Ivoire claim victory in the tournament. Once again, welcome to Africa Live. Great to have you along with us for this hour. Let's begin in France, where the country is piling pressure on the European Union to agree to sanctions against Mali over delayed elections. The West African bloc, ECOWAS, has cut off financial aid and frozen Mali's assets at the central bank of West African states over the military's decision to hold on to power. French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian now says Mali risks being suffocated unless the military junta lives up to its responsibilities. The junta has proposed to stay in power for up to 5 years before staging elections. This is against international demands to respect a promise to hold elections in February.
Ce n'est plus une affaire franco-malienne.
It is no longer a Franco-Malian affair. The situation in Mali and the Sahel is an African affair as well as a European affair. The best proof is that the 13 ECOWAS countries have taken a unanimous position, both to condemn what the junta is doing after its 2 coups, and also to take sanctions to prevent Mali from drifting into a situation of quasi-dictatorship. We are going to propose to apply them at a European level and also apply them with regard to both the Malian leaders, but also the economic and financial measures that have been taken by the African countries.
Situation de quasi-dictature.
Well, let's get deeper into this. We have Farahiman Rodriguez Kone, a senior researcher in the Sahel team at the Institute for Security Studies. Mr. Kone, welcome to Africa Live. Thank you for joining us. The French foreign minister is confident that the EU will adopt their proposal for sanctions against Mali today. How would such EU sanctions impact Mali?
Well, indeed, EU sanctions will further restrict the Malian transitional authorities' capacities. It is likely that the EU will echo the ECOWAS decision to impose economic and financial sanctions in a country which is already one of the poorest in the world. The Malian economy is highly dependent to the outside world, and France is its first economic partner. This will lead to the disruption of the supply of the agricultural and the mining sectors, which are the main economic revenue sources of the national economy. And in addition, the financial restriction will mean that the country won't be able to access the European economic and financial markets. The suspension of flight from EU, which is already the case from Air France since yesterday.
Well, Mali's transitional authorities are calling on citizens to stage major protests tomorrow against new sanctions announced by the regional bloc ECOWAS. What kind of impact would this have on both ECOWAS and inside Mali itself? Now, do you see the Malians rallying behind the military leadership on this?
ECOWAS suspected the transitional authorities to confiscate the power by avoiding election. And that's why the regional body calls for a quick and a clear electoral timetable. But the Malian authorities are arguing that election is not the immediate priority by referring to the meeting they organized, I think, in November, a national consultation process. So the objectives of this street mobilization is to show that They have strong support from population, which also strongly reject the imposed sanction. In short, it's a tactic before the negotiation phase, which will certainly open with ECOWAS in next days. And what we are showing here, we are seeing here, there is less people who are against, we are supporting ECOWAS sanction. So more and more we are seeing that there is a kind of popular sympathy for the government, and the demonstration for tomorrow will certainly be a popular one.
All right, well, there you have it. France backs sanctions against Mali over delayed polls. Fahim Rahman Kone, thank you for your time here on Africa Live. Let's turn our attention now to Somalia, where the country's president, Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, has confirmed his country's ambitions to join the rotational UN Security Council non-permanent members, as well as the African Union Peace and Security Council. Now, this is to strengthen regional international relations and diplomacy. Here is Mohamed Kahie once again with more details from the Somali capital, Mogadishu.
During his address to a nation that covered various topics, President Farmajo said his administration has focused on strengthening the country's foreign policy based on respect for diplomatic norms.
The federal government of Somalia is getting ready as a candidate for the African Union Peace and Security Committee, which will be conducted soon. Likewise, we are also set to be part of the non-permanent members of the UN Security Council, which we have been absent from for the past 50 years.
Last year, Somalia became a key member of the UN Human Rights Council and the deputy president of the 75th session of the United Nations. Despite setbacks in the past years, diplomats have acknowledged that the Horn of African nation has a better chance of getting representation at the UN Security Council, with strong support from key allies in the African Union and the Arab League.
Somalia has a better chance because of the backing from the African Union as a founding member that backed the independence struggle of several countries. Likewise, it's counting on the support of the Arab League bloc, Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, and Asia, led by China, which shares strong historic relations that originates from Mogadishu's support for Beijing at the UN Security Council.
Several countries have reopened their diplomatic missions in Somalia, following the return of peace and stability in recent years. Somalia's strategic locations in the Horn of Africa has attracted the global powers such as China, the United States, and Turkey for its state-building process for future cooperations in international peace and security. Mohamed Kahie, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Sudan's former Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok is warning that the ongoing political stalemate that has gripped the country since the military takeover could become a full-blown crisis and damage its already battered economy. Hamdok resigned more than a week ago amid widespread pro-democracy protests following a military coup that derailed the country's fragile transition to civilian rule. Naba Muad'Din has more from Khartoum.
It's been over a week since Abdullah Hamdok resigned as Prime Minister, leaving Sudanese politics at a crossroads. The international community has offered to mediate between civilians and military leaders, but tensions over who should lead the country are hampering efforts to reach a political settlement.
People need to sit and talk. There's no other way for a solution. Escalation will lead the country into an undefined future.
The country is now in a crossroad, but we want a civilian government. We don't want a military rule. We have experienced it for decades.
Some analysts believe it's time the two sides made concessions.
The civilian and military leaders should adopt a new partnership, and this is also faced by the streets that against any form of power sharing between the two sides. And I do think that this partnership between the military and civilian is must.
But finding an arrangement that suits everyone will be difficult.
While some pro-democracy groups say a partnership with the military is not what they want, other activists think a political compromise should be found to prevent the country from sliding into a civil war.
Since the October military takeover of power, the country has suffered an absence of government, which many say has led to a weakened economy and fragility. The military leaders say the formation of an executive government is needed to end the weeks-long political crisis. But efforts to form such an administration could be rejected by political parties if a consensus is not achieved first. Naba Muhyiddin, CGTN, Khartoum, Sudan.
The South African development community has extended the mandate of troops it sent to help secure and stabilize northern Mozambique. Member countries have agreed that there is need to extend the mission of the SADC Standby Force mission deployed in July last year to combat terrorism and acts of violent extremism. Angela Coppola has more details.
The SADC leaders are concerned about the situation in northern Mozambique and are determined to make a difference.
What remains now is for us to stay the course and stick together. We cannot relent. We cannot regress. We cannot retreat. Our approach to this mission must continue to be multidimensional and comprehensive. It must not only focus on neutralizing the threat, but also have a post-conflict plan.
We fully understand that we are in an emergency and that we need to move with speed to implement the decisions taken by our heads of state and government. On this matter, we will continue to be guided by the decisions of the Ministerial Committee of the organ troika itself, and the summit.
Analysts say it's not a surprise that the regional bloc has extended the mandate for the troop deployment.
At least 2 years are needed in this mission. So they have extended now, and I think they will keep extending for at least 2 years. That is the minimal time to reach the stability, at least in the capital guard.
A framework to help Mozambique tackle terrorism, which outlines, among others, actions for consolidating peace, security and socio-economic recovery of the Cabo Delgado region, was also approved.
SADC, for the first time in the continent, is conducting the mission with its own financial means. So that is with own funds. So this is a game changing in the continent. So yeah, we are poor countries, but our poor countries are trying to do something good with their own funds.
There are concerns that the insurgency could spread. Tanzania has had several incursions recently.
Is this mission going to be extended to the new territories? I mean, Tanzania and Niassa, that's very difficult to know, but it's something that SADC should consider in the near future.
It's imperative that the regional bloc deal with this national issue because it could become a regional issue. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Our coverage continues on Africa Live. Here's what's ahead. South African schools reopen to a rotational attendance system amid fears of a surge in COVID infections. Welcome back to Africa Live. Thanks for sticking with us. South Africa's Department of Basic Education has announced that a rotational timetable will continue to be followed as inland schools reopened across 5 provinces on Wednesday. South Africa uses a rotation system where students alternate days at school. This is due to the ongoing concerns around the COVID-19 pandemic and potential transmission. CGTN's Ulysses Jamila has more.
The reopening of schools here in South Africa comes at a time when the country is still dealing with the Omicron variant. As a result, strict protocols will continue to be maintained. Schools where 1 meter social distancing cannot be practiced will continue to use rotational timetable. Other schools, like Matlapaneng Primary School in Gauteng province, have come up with ways to ensure that COVID-19 regulations are strictly adhered to.
The school has established the COVID-19 committee. The COVID-19 committee comprises of one parent and the teacher component and also the admin component and one learner. We made sure that we adhere to the COVID regulation. We have our stations, the screening stations. Every morning, as you can see where we are right now, learners are being screened. And in each and every classroom, we have a running water whereby learners are requested to wash their hands on daily basis every morning.
According to Basic Education Minister Nta, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on schooling over the past 2 years. As a result, many schools had to be closed.
Which has very devastating impacts on basic education in the past 2 years. We have spoken extensively about the learning losses that we've incurred as a direct result of COVID-19, the loss of teaching and learning time. As a sector, we've sought out different strategies to keep the sector going, even under very difficult conditions.
Minister Motshekga says in late 2021, the education sector saw a significant decline in the number of schools that had to be closed due to COVID-19. This, she says, can be attributed in part to the successful vaccination program of education personnel from June 2021.
We also believe that also the high vaccination rates that we had in the sector have allowed us some element of stability. And we wish to applaud all our schools for doing all they could to ensure that the protocols are observed. And we expect the same also this year to make sure that we keep tight to the protocols and limit any disruptions that will come because of schools closing and opening because of infections in schools.
For now, schools will not offer vaccinations on site as the health department does not have enough capacity to assist in administering the jabs. Yudisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Zimbabwe has welcomed a donation of an additional 10 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines from the Chinese government. President Emmerson Mnangagwa says the 6 million Sinovac and 4 million Sinopharm vaccines would help ease health challenges in Zimbabwe.
Government applauds China's strong support and commitment to ensuring the availability of affordable and effective vaccines, not only to our country, Zimbabwe, and the African continent, but to the entire global community. This is highly commendable and represents compassionate leadership, absolute regard for human life, dignity, and safety, as well as exemplary global solidarity in the face of the unprecedented health challenges of our time wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic. For us in Zimbabwe, this huge and a timely gesture of support comes at a critical phase in our fight against the highly infectious Omicron variant, which threatens to erode our impressive gains in the fight against COVID-19 and our strides towards achieving national herd immunity. We in Zimbabwe, therefore, cherish this continued Chinese support in the fight against the global COVID-19 pandemic.
Wildlife protection agencies in Uganda are warning that the illegal trade in game trophies is rising despite tough laws in place to stop it. The Uganda Wildlife Authority says the country is a key transit route used by traffickers ferrying their illegal haul to Asian countries where the trade is lucrative. Isabel Nikuria reports.
Stockpiles of ivory and pangolin scales en route to Asian countries. Wildlife officials in Uganda are seizing contraband more often now. The wildlife products are said to be coming from neighboring countries like the DRC and South Sudan.
We are arresting quite a number of them, and when we compare, we realize that there is an increase, and some of the Ugandans now are getting involved in this trade.
Uganda made over 2,000 arrests last year compared to about 1,000 in 2020. But there is worry that the traffickers are getting better at beating the system.
So the intelligence is high. So you would expect that even traders in this kind of illegalities are aware of the intelligence, and they would always plan to see when probably the intelligence is weakest. So it is difficult to say how frequent or how often, because it is a cat and mouse kind of game.
Customs officials are being weighed down by the increasing illegal wildlife trade. Scanners at all border points have been installed to detect and disrupt the wildlife trade. But with the high demand of wildlife trophies in Asian markets, traffickers are risking it even with tough laws in Uganda. Globally, environmental policy advocates are pushing for a ban on wildlife markets, saying it's a threat to wildlife conservation. Some Asian countries have already put restrictions on wildlife trade and have even extended it to poaching of rare and endangered species. In Uganda, offenders pay up to $6,000 in fines or face life in prison or even both.
There's a very high risk because traders also in illicit goods are usually knowledgeable people, but some of them are also very skilled people. Every time such busts have happened, you may find that there have been certain exchanges with security forces or even our own personnel. So they are very risky ventures. Many of these people tend to be armed or prepared to put an offensive when things go wrong.
Some of these high-value products like rhino horns, python skins and hippopotamus teeth are said to be used for their medicinal qualities. But every contraband of wildlife trophies means a destruction of wildlife attractions. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN Kampala, Uganda.
The news continues on Africa Live. Time now for a short break. Don't go away. Here's what's ahead. The World Bank cautions over slow economic growth and rising levels of inequality.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back. The World Bank has slashed its global growth forecast for 2022 and 2023. That's as it cautioned that a rise in inflation, debt, and income inequality could jeopardize the recovery in emerging and developing economies. In its latest semi-annual forecast, the World Bank predicts world economic growth will decelerate markedly to 4.1% this year from 5.5% last year and drop to 3.2% in 2023. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the Washington-based lender has raised the alarm about growing levels of inequality both within and between nations. It's now forecasting a yawning gap in growth rates between advanced and less wealthy economies. Richer nations are expected to see a deceleration in economic growth from 5% last year to 3.8% in 2022 and 2.3% in 2023. For emerging and developing economies, by contrast, the bank is calling for growth rates to plunge from 6.3% in 2021 to 4.6% this year and 4.4% in 2023. The debate over national debt continues in Tanzania, with President Samia Suluhu Hassan saying loans taken were sustainable and there was room for more borrowing. According to the central bank, Tanzania's national debt stock swelled by $5.3 billion in the year leading up to October 2021. CGTN's Daniel Kijo has been following this story from Dar es Salaam.
The debate over whether to keep borrowing
is perhaps the most burning question currently in Tanzanian politics. The country's $35.7 billion foreign debt is causing an alarm. President Samia Suluhu Hassan's government says it is not discouraged from seeking external funding. President Hassan said the loans are to fund strategic projects, including the construction of the standard gauge railway.
We have been borrowing since way back, and even the development we have now is due to these loans. So I don't see why these loans are being considered a big deal. It's not a big deal. Our focus is to continue developing our people.
According to the central bank, the country can borrow up to 70% of its GDP, and it had only reached 27.9% in 2020. Analysts say, with Tanzania being one of the most conservative borrowers in East Africa, there's nothing to be alarmed about.
So we are nowhere in terms of the radar of being an alarmingly highly indebted country. We are able to service the debt certainly by the amounts that we're able to generate from tax revenues and other areas. But there is you must continue to be cautious, and I think I trust that the government will be able to do that and to borrow more smartly going forward as well.
Tanzania is currently ranked 109 out of 170 highly indebted countries globally. The debate over Tanzania's borrowing was sparked by the Speaker of the National Assembly, Job Ndugai, who criticized the borrowing trend under President Samia Suluhu Hassan, saying that the country is better off relying on internal revenue sources to finance development projects. He has since resigned from his post. Experts say the government keeps focusing on concessional financing in order to ensure that projects they fund have a large impact on growth and exports.
It helps you to be transparent. It helps you to effectively utilize the borrowing to create capacity, to create capital formation in countries so that you can be much more productive, create competitive exports that gives you the surplus, that creates the revenues, that removes you off the loan wheel cycle and helps you reduce the amount to which the amount that you're borrowing at.
In the first 9 months of President Samia Suluhu Hassan's leadership, Tanzania received about $3 billion in loans. Many say this is due to President Hassan's improved relations with development partners. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania.
Ugandan authorities have agreed to allow cargo trucks crews with negative COVID-19 test results to transit through the country. As Leon Sienga reports, hundreds of trucks have been stuck at the Uganda-Kenya border as truck drivers protested new COVID-19 containment measures.
These are some of the first trucks to arrive into Uganda since the decision was made. A resolution by ministers from 4 East African countries agreed that Uganda would allow truck drivers with negative COVID-19 results from member countries to transit through to their destinations. The settlement followed a 6-day strike by the drivers who protested Uganda's proposed review of the cargo and drivers tracking system. The system allowed COVID-19 testing done within a duration of 7 instead of 14 days. The protest paralyzed business at the Malaba border post, which is one of the major entry points for trucks bringing in goods from Kenya's port of Mombasa. Uganda is a transit route for imports destined for Rwanda, South Sudan, and even the Democratic Republic of Congo. At the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, Uganda was offering free coronavirus tests to truck drivers. However, a $30 fee was later introduced to cover government costs. Now, all countries have agreed that free antigen tests will be done. All fully vaccinated drivers should have their negative results valid for 14 days. The situation will be reviewed next week. Leon Sanyange, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Tunisian authorities are planning to institute several measures as the government targets to reach a deal with the International Monetary Fund before the end of the first quarter of 2022. The measures include cutting subsidies on energy products, freezing civil service wages, and hiring over the next 3 years. But as Adnan Shawalshi now reports, activists have warned that the proposed reforms could exacerbate the country's economic and social crisis.
The Tunisian non-governmental organization iWatch published a copy of the program developed by the North African state's government ahead of crucial talks with the International Monetary Fund for a much-needed financial bailout. The NGO denounced lack of government communication on its plans with the multilateral lender.
This secret document was developed by the government without discussing its content with experts from the Labour Union and the Confederation of Industry. This plan will have negative repercussions on the Tunisian economy. Authorities know that voters will reject these reforms. These might impact the legislative elections in December 2022. That is why the painful measures will be imposed in 2023 after the elections.
iWatch revealed that the gradual lifting of subsidies on energy products will pave the way for reaching real prices by 2026. It will also increase low-voltage electricity prices for Tunisian households. Accordingly, the government will also develop a digital platform for registration and management of the targeted subsidization of commodities.
There are too many contradictions in the approach of the government. What it says to the Tunisian people is different from what it plans with the IMF in terms of structural reforms. This is unacceptable.
However, Tunisia's finance minister explained that the government is preparing a consensual program for major reforms that will stabilize and kickstart economic recovery after the pandemic fallout and years of political instability.
The government has developed a draft reform document for Tunisia. It could coincide or intersect with the reform plan made by the International Monetary Fund. We will discuss the structural reforms and agree on this document with all our partners at home before presenting it to the IMF.
The 2022 state budget provides for early retirement before the legal age of 62. The government also encourages civil servants to start their own businesses. These measures are aimed at reducing the public sector wage bill in the North African country.
Tunisian authorities said that a set of realistic and acceptable reforms may be reached with the IMF before the end of the first quarter of 2022. Civil society organizations are calling for a dialogue on the country's structural reforms before a deal is signed with the US-based lender. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
And we're not done just yet. We've got your sports news coming up after the break. Stay with us. Here's what's